Good morning. Welcome to our final broadcast of Beyond the Ballot, our series that looks at the key national security and foreign policy challenges facing either an incoming Biden administration or a second Trump term. We are so thrilled to have as our closer for this series, Ambassador Victoria Nuland, who had a storied 32-year career in the State Department. She served under 5 presidents, 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats. She has so many things on her resume, but I'm going to make this brief so we can just get into the conversation. But she served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from 2013 to 2017 and was the point person for President Obama during the Ukraine crisis. Prior to that, she was a State Department spokesperson for Hillary Clinton. Before that, she served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and she also did a stint as Vice President Cheney's Deputy National Security Advisor. Ambassador Nuland, we are so thrilled to have you here today. I should also say that today's session is being co-sponsored by the Our Women Network, really in recognition of just what an incredible thought leader and role model you are for women across this industry. So welcome, Ambassador Nuland. We're thrilled to have you. And I just wonder if you could start off by discussing a little bit of your biography. In our conversation before we went on, you mentioned that before you joined the State Department at the age of 23, you were on a Russian trawler for 7 months. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit of background on how you came to your career in the State Department.
Well, thanks, Halima. It's wonderful to be here with your colleagues and with your clients and talk about all these vital issues. Thanks for this invitation. Yeah, I came out of Brown University, where I know you are today.
Yes.
And I went and worked on the Hill for a member of Congress. And then I had this opportunity, because I had Russian language coming out of Brown, to go work on a Soviet fishing trawler off the coast of Washington State. And that was an amazing 7-month experience, 80 Russian men and 7 Russian women, mostly the cooks and me. They taught me all my stores. They taught me about communist economy. You know, we didn't do too much until the end of the month when we had to fish like crazy to fulfill the monthly plan. And then when I got back on shore off the coast of Seattle, I picked up, 7 months worth of snail mail, and in there was an expired invitation to join a foreign service entering class 2 months earlier. And I literally, if you remember what payphones are, I literally went to the end of the dock and put a quarter in the payphone and called up the State Department and said, can I still join? And then I called my congressman and said, I'm not coming back to work. I'm going to go be a U.S. diplomat. And that was just a spectacular and fun start to 32 years of excitement in the Foreign Service.
Ambassador Nuland, everyone is talking about the upcoming election as one of the most consequential elections in American history. Can you talk about the importance of this election for U.S. foreign policy and America's place in the world?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, Halima, I worked happily for Democrats and Republicans for 32 years, working in the private office of Dick Cheney and then being spokesperson for Hillary Clinton, and never had difficulties wearing America's T-shirt out there in the world. But our current leader has a very different approach to how the U.S. should operate in the world, and he's executed that strategy over the last 4 years. And it is a much more America first, as he says, or go it alone, as others say, approach to foreign policy. And it also treats allies and adversaries either the same, with equal amounts of demand, or in some cases, authoritarians seem to get a better deal from the United States than our friends in Germany, etc. So it's really been a sea change in the way the U.S. operates in the world. There have been some benefits to that policy. I think, a tougher and more clear-eyed approach to China, which is becoming a more bipartisan approach now, a clear-eyed sense of the importance of getting trade agreements right, etc. but it's also really frayed our relationships with our friends. And views of the United States around the world are at lows that we haven't seen since the Iraq War. So that's very difficult. So this is an election where you will either have that approach to national security and many other things vindicated by the American electorate, and we will and the rest of the world will have to decide that it wasn't an aberration, that this is the new America, and they will also, I think, move in a direction of their own nationalities first, and you'll have less of a collaborative, cooperative system for all the good and difficulty that brings. You know, sometimes when you work collaboratively, you end up at lowest common denominator, but often if you don't, you end up having to bear all the burden of your policies. Or you have a candidate in Vice President Biden who is very much a product of that long period of U.S. building alliances, strengthening alliances, starting policy with allies, and then going out into the world with all of the opportunity, but also, as I said, challenge that brings. So it's a very, very different approach to U.S. leadership in the world.
So if you were back in your old job at the State Department, or one of your many jobs at the State Department, what do you think is going to be at the top of the agenda in terms of the foreign policy challenges for either Trump 2 or incoming Biden? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be Russia? What's the presidential daily briefing actually going to look like for the incoming president?
You know, I think if President Trump is reelected, it will very much be China. It'll be more punishment. It'll be more of a sense that we've got to rally the rest of the world to a tougher place and blame for the place we've come to laid squarely at their doorstep. I think China will be also a central issue for Joe Biden if he is elected, but I think first for him will be the domestic, as he says, build back better, and an effort to do that collaboratively with European and Asian allies in particular. So, you know, Europeans are already talking about their Green Deal and putting their recovery dollars into a greener future. Biden talks about the same. Can we have a collaborative or harmonious approach to that? How do we spur innovation, etc.? So I think you'll have an effort to meet all these hard challenges, but first and foremost, the COVID challenge, the economic challenge, together with allies for Biden as his first priorities.
Before we turn to China, I want to talk about Russia. I reread your fantastic foreign affairs piece from the summer, and I was really struck by, it's a great piece. I recommend everybody who's listening today to read the piece in the July-August issue of Foreign Affairs. And you really talk about the fact that, you know, regardless of who wins, each administration should and will have to try to re-engage Vladimir Putin. Can you talk about what that would look like, and more about sort of what is Putin's sort of worldview, and how weak or strong is Russia? Do they play a weak hand well, you know, or should we really be concerned about their active measures?
Well, whether you're talking about their efforts to disrupt democratic elections and execute influence campaigns and cyber campaigns around the democratic world, and we, I think, won't know completely what they've been up to this time until after the election, or whether it's their growing footprint in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, elsewhere, or whether it's, you know, Putin's penchant for poisoning or killing his adversaries at home or abroad, Ukraine. Russia, I think you had it right, Putin plays a weak hand well, but the hand that Putin is not playing well is his domestic hand. And you can see that now in the last couple of years as polling on his leadership is going down, Russian people not reacting well to the way he responded to the COVID crisis, you know, sort of bunkered behind his dacha walls while the Russian people and particularly small business people suffered, and, you know, crumbling schools and hospitals and roads. So these foreign adventures and great expenditures of money externally are not delivering the bread and circuses, the excitement for the Russian people that will allow them to look past what he's not delivering for them in governance. So it's a very interesting time. And I frankly think that we in the community of allied countries have not responded coherently, collaboratively enough, and he's to all of Russia's malign behavior, and therefore he's been able to navigate between us, he's been able to separate us. I think we can do more to put pressure on his external behavior and work more closely with the Russian people than we have. We just haven't put the effort into it.
When we think about pressure, I mean, I'm an energy analyst, I'm a follower of OPEC and Russia's relationship with OPEC, and obviously we've had a big fall in oil prices. How much pressure is that putting on the government there? I mean, we really saw the Russians saying, like, look, we have higher fiscal break-evens than the Saudis, we can endure lower prices. How much pain can they endure in terms of low oil prices? And then I want to ask about the role of energy sanctions, like on the Nord Stream 2 project. Like, how much can that move the needle in terms of altering Russian behavior?
Well, as you know, Putin is sitting on a big sovereign wealth fund. That was one of the lessons that he learned from the Yeltsin 90s, that, you know, even if your people are not getting the benefit of the tax dollars, you should sock it away for rainy days. So, you know, that allows him to manage these downturns. But, you know, Russia has been a big gas station with very little else in terms of global output and export for a long, long time. And as the world increasingly moves away from carbon-based energy, that's getting more and more old-fashioned, and it's getting, you know, less and less economical. So, you know, it is another failure of leadership that in 20 years in power, he hasn't diversified that economy, and he hasn't tapped into the prodigious brains of the Russian people to do what he promised, which was to become a tech superpower, you know, to really modernize their agriculture sector, all that kind of thing. And the adversarial relationship that he's taken to Europe in particular has really closed off market opportunities for Russia. So now they're left at the mercy of China, which is, you know, pretty rapacious in its trade deals. So the Russians aren't necessarily getting the best deal. So, you know, I think in the longer term, it's going to bring Russia to grief. In the short term, you know, he's got to manage these prices to the extent that he can, so he doesn't hemorrhage out of his sovereign wealth fund.
And again, just to stick with the sanctions theme for a moment, I mean, you spent a lot of time working on these key sanctions on energy projects with my good friend Amos Hochstein. How do you think, you know, the Russian government is looking at Nord Stream 2 sanctions? Are they concerned that it actually could block completion of the project? How much do these sanctions alter their behavior?
Well, I mean, my biggest concern about using the sanctions tool on Nord Stream 2 is not that we've applied it, but that we applied it unilaterally, and it hits, you know, German companies and Northern European companies equally to hitting the Russians. And I would have rather continued the approach that we were on, which is to try to have the US work extensively with Germany and with the EU to propose alternative sources of energy for Europe rather than becoming more dependent on Russia, and to throw up, you know, all kinds of hurdles, whether they were environmental or engineering or otherwise, so that the project didn't get built. So, you know, now I think the sanctions have had some effect in terms of blocking financing, etc. But what's been most salient in terms of slowing this project is the courage of some of the countries on the littoral who have used, you know, environmental regulations, oversight, big EU to slow it to such a point that, you know, it should have been finished 3 years ago, and it hasn't been. So, you know, we'll see.
And this is the last question on this topic, but I wonder if you could talk about sort of the role of U.S. natural gas in foreign policy. I mean, I remember during the Obama administration, there was this talk about sort of U.S. gas exports potentially helping the foreign policy of breaking, you know, Russia's hold on the European gas market. And it seems now that's not really talked about as much. Do you still think that, in sort of the Obama administration and the Biden orbit, that there is still a view of the usefulness of gas for this foreign policy towards Russia?
Well, I would say first and foremost, the importance of U.S. gas at the moment is it makes us energy self-sufficient. So we are not dependent on OPEC. We have that opportunity to stand up to them. We are also buying time to develop non-carbon alternatives across the United States. And I'm hopeful that there will be, whoever is elected, there'll be stimulus money going into a greener economy, and that we will be harmonious with the Europeans in that kind of a thing. So that's the first thing, is ending U.S. dependence and ending the impact that has on having to kowtow to oil states, et cetera. But, particularly in Europe and to a lesser extent in Asia, gas is seen now as the cheaper bridge to this greener economy. And we did all over Europe, working with big EU, try to provide incentives for countries, whether it was Lithuania or Finland or Bulgaria or Greece or Croatia, to build LNG terminals so that whether they were buying from the US or whether they were buying from Qatar or elsewhere, they would have options other than Russian oil. And it would drive down price, and it would create more opportunities because, as you know, Russia has always used its oil and gas as a weapon, and that was one of the key issues in the Ukraine war and the Donbass and Crimea war of 2014 and 15. So that's very important in terms of having alternatives.
I want to now switch to the topic of defense spending. Again, in this great foreign affairs piece, you really talk about the need to maintain robust defense budgets and to modernize our military, keep up with the modernization of the military to deal with the sort of Russian military advances. So I wonder if you could talk about sort of in more detail about how optimally that would proceed and whether in an age of constrained budgets because of COVID-19, what is really realistic in terms of defense spending?
I think particularly as China becomes better understood as a bipartisan issue and as a challenge, there is more consensus to maintain strong defense budgets. I think the issue, though, is not just spending big, but spending smart and spending on the next generation of tools that we need, particularly in the new realms like cyber and gray war and these kinds of things. And ensuring that, yes, we have enough aircraft carriers to keep the South China Sea free for navigation and all of those things, but that we're not spending on lots of heavy ground war things that we're not going to use. So, I think that the other question here is whether we can spend collaboratively, collectively with our NATO allies. So, one of the things we've always said with allies is that the price of having the U.S. Defense umbrella is that you need to spend 2% of your GDP in Europe to match us so that we're building together. And that's been hard. So I think the question for either candidate is how to ensure that you also apply COVID relief funds to the defense and security sector. There's no reason why some of those dollars can't provide jobs and opportunity in new security technology fields. We're all going to have to invest in AI. We're all going to have to invest in quantum. We're all going to have to invest in stronger cyber defenses. And that's just as important as building the big heavy metal systems. So, I think both candidates have an opportunity to have defense spending be part of recovery spending and get the security benefit vis-a-vis both Russia and China at the same time that you're developing jobs and you are maintaining the budgets that we need to stay safe.
And just to keep with that for a moment, do you see sort of different priorities on defense spending, cyber, AI for an incoming Biden administration or a Trump administration? Like, how would the policies potentially look different?
Trump has put a big priority on small nuclear weapons. Which is pretty terrifying for a lot of folk on the Democratic side. He has also put a lot of emphasis on some of the heavy metal building in some of the red states that have supported him. I think there's a question about whether he would allow a next generation of Republican defense specialists to make that leap in terms of modernization, in terms of adjustment. He's had a pretty fraught relationship with the uniformed military, and he's also had a fraught relationship with the Congress, because those kinds of big changes require pretty strong consensus and some tough choices. On the Biden side, I think the question is, half of the party thinks you can cut defense spending in half and be just as safe. And so there's going to be a struggle if Biden is elected to maintain those strong levels, but then to spend smarter and to spend 2 generations out, to spend greener, to spend on things that are more integrative of advanced technologies, etc., and to spend collectively with allies to reduce U.S. burden.
So I'm going to, in a moment, turn it over to our internet analyst, Sweta Kajuria, to talk, to ask a question. And I want to tell everybody on the line that if you have questions, please send them in and we will try to get to them. But obviously, the big question, on everyone's mind is also going to be about China. And you mentioned it's at the top of the agenda for either a second Trump administration or an incoming Biden administration. Can you talk about where you see the U.S.-China relationship developing? I mean, you served in China, one of your first diplomatic assignments. What are the real risks of conflict? We've asked our speakers across this series what we should be watching for in terms of tripwires, potential conflict. What's the path to de-escalation? If you could sort of give us your views on that, that would be obviously enormously helpful for everyone.
Well, it's interesting. For most of the last 30 years, our goal was for China to get stronger, but as Bob Zoellick likes to say, to be a responsible stakeholder within the international system, to bring them into the WTO, to bring them into global governance fora. We had a success in the Obama administration getting them to agree to Paris climate norms, etc. But when Xi Jinping came to power, it wasn't enough for him for China to be a strong power, a great power within an international system that the U.S. led in building. He wants to make the world safe for autocracies like China. And so he wants to change the rules of the road. And he's doing that by flooding the international organizations with Chinese influence. He's doing that by threatening his neighbors militarily and economically, and he's doing that with this, what looked like a very generous Belt and Road offer to poorer, weaker countries, and even countries like Eastern Europe, and his digital Silk Road, where he's building everybody's telecoms virtually for free, until people started to wake up and understand that this was allowing China to acquire critical infrastructure, strategic heights, intelligence opportunities all over the world. So I think both parties have woken up to this. I think the difference in approach is that the Bush administration, the Trump administration, has taken a very America first, America alone, all the rest of you follow what we do on Huawei, on trade, etc. approach. There have been some initial successes in the trade area, but they haven't developed the kind of pressure on China that it hasn't been able to circumvent and get around, I think. I mean, we're starting to, I think, on the Huawei side, but again, you can't beat something with nothing. So on the Biden, I think if you have Trump, he will continue to try to blame China for most things, create this almost Soviet-style clash of civilizations and competition to justify most U.S. behavior. I think if you have Biden, he will instead start with allies and try to come up with a joint approach of what we're demanding on the trade side in terms of reciprocity, in terms of state support, in terms of IPR, all of these kinds of things. So it's not just our 330 million person economy, it's also coupled with Europe's 350 million and perhaps the Asian democracies as well, such that China feels more pressure on the trade side. I think the other question is, will we be able to develop alternatives to Huawei together? And will that be faster if we work together? Whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, you're going to start to see talk about export control restrictions across the space. And again, I would rather do this together with allies. Let's develop alternatives in rare earth. Let's develop alternatives for semiconductors. Let's develop alternatives to Huawei together. Let's get our AI house in order so that they're not just sucking all the data that they can to fuel their system, and we're standing by and watching. So I think that you will have a Biden effort to work together with allies. But again, if allies think that whether they're in Asia or they're in Europe, that all goes back to normal with Biden and it'll be a picnic, I think he will be demanding of them, particularly on the China front, and that may be uncomfortable given where they are on some of these things.
Right, because I think you're right that there is a perception in the market that Biden would not use tariffs. He would not go down that path. And so I think it's interesting to think about, what are the sources of continuity potentially on China policy, and where would there be divergence? And I'm wondering if you could talk about, more generally, what are the potential tripwires for conflict? I mean, we've had some speakers who really do subscribe to the Thucydides trap. We've had other speakers say, no, we don't think there's going to be a conflict with China. It can be carefully managed. What should we be looking for? Is it South China Sea? Is it Taiwan? Like, what could bring us closer to conflict with China than market participants maybe realize?
I think Taiwan is definitely the place to watch. Because I don't think that either we or he has a good strategy. I do think that sometimes when you increase the pressure on adversaries, they feel the need to lash out where they think you're weak. And China, I think at the current moment, believes that it has the ability to overwhelm Taiwan quickly, and particularly in a Biden administration might miscalculate and think that the United States and its allies would not come to Taiwan's defense. So it might choose to put facts on the ground. And including, Halima, traditionally, this interregnum between the election and the inauguration, even when you have continuity, is a dangerous period because adversaries try to set the terms ahead of the new term. So it's definitely a time to be careful and a time to watch. Hong Kong, unfortunately, it's really quite tragic, and I think the Chinese believe that they have largely won there. I think there is a question what the financial sector chooses to do in Hong Kong, because it's not the place that it used to be. Is there a way to better support that original deal? It's hard to know. But again, I think the Chinese are still benefiting from the fact that we are not completely together with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, with the European allies on how we block and tackle particularly China's strategic infrastructure acquisitions and its technology advances. And that's allowing them to continue to put facts on the ground before we're ready. So no matter who's elected, I'd like to see us play our game better, both with Russia and with China.
So I'm now going to turn to our internet analyst, Shweta Kajoria, to ask a question. So Shweta, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Halima, and thank you, Ambassador Nuland, for joining us. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the social media companies. Do you think that social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube are doing enough to address issues related to disinformation and election interference? And if not, what do you think should they be doing? And do you also think that the U.S. government should be more involved in mandating changes to these platforms?
I do. I think it's long overdue for a collaboration, conversation, effort to find common ground between government and the big tech platforms. I don't like the idea of regulating them without them. I would rather try to work through, first in the US, but also in a US-European context, because as you know, the European Union is moving forward with all kinds of regulation, whether it's on content moderation or tax or privacy, all of these kinds of things. So, you know, we'll see what happens in the US Congress session today, but the leaders of these companies are actually starting to ask for a more regulated environment. And if it's done collaboratively, it would maintain a level playing field economically for them, but also create a more responsible rules of the road and norms, etc. I also think that if we want to set the rules of the road as democracies and as free economies and ensure that we promote digital advancement that favors freedom rather than digital advancement that favors authoritarians, we better get in the room and figure out what those rules are. Otherwise, China's going to be setting them, and they already are with the export of surveillance and other tools that, you know, allow government to abuse citizens even more than is happening now.
Great, thank you. And the first question that has come in from our listeners and viewers is on the long-term impact of Brexit.
Yeah, very, very painful one for those of us who worked with an EU that had a strong UK voice within it, particularly on issues of free trade and ensuring that the EU did not turn in a protectionist direction and all kinds of things like that. Including the EU's foreign policy posture and its willingness to go out in the world and try to support development and other things. Look, I think it's up to the UK. You know, I think that the UK can either come out of this with all that they promised and be Great Britain in the sense that they use their independence to be even stronger in promoting security, prosperity, openness, and thought leadership on these issues around the world, or they can cut budgets and creep into their hole and be Little England and isolate themselves. And I think they haven't, you know, despite the rhetoric, they haven't made those decisions, or it's not evident yet in budgeting, etc. But there is no reason why, in trade terms, you can't have both a strong UK-EU open market agreement and a strong US-UK trade agreement that gets rid of regulation and red tape, maybe not comprehensive, but that the UK couldn't become a bridge to that bigger agreement that we tried in the Obama administration and we couldn't get, which was a comprehensive agreement across the Atlantic. So, you know, I think the UK can play a big role. They still have the largest military in Europe and the most capable military in Europe. Are they going to continue to fund it? How are they going to collaborate with the EU on those the missions that the EU does? Are they going to become a leader in how we manage China? And again, I don't think anybody, well, there are some, I don't believe in making an enemy of China. I do believe in managing the way we deal with China such that if it's going to benefit from this system that we've built, that it follows the rules. And the UK could be a strong voice in that, or it really can go internal. And I hope that whoever's elected will do more as Brexit finishes, as the deal is concluded, we hope, at the end of this year, to embrace the UK, work with it, and ensure that it becomes a strong bridge across the Atlantic and not a little pebble in the sea.
That's excellent. So we have now two questions on China that I'm going to sort of tie together. We have a question on whether India and China, there could be a tripwire for a conflict there, given what happened with the border dispute. And then we had a question about Chinese military modernization. We had Michael Morrell as one of our speakers a couple weeks ago, and he really talked about the advances in terms of Chinese military modernization and the kind of strategic challenge that poses to the United States. So if you could tackle both of those, that would be great.
Sure. Well, we already have conflict, as you know.
Yes.
Persistent military conflict. It's at a relatively low level, but still. And we've got considerable trade conflict as well. You know, I have clients in India who are experiencing trade slowdowns and supply chain problems back and forth with China because, you know, governments are getting into this stuff and trying to punish each other through trade. So it is not a stable situation right now. And frankly, I think that this is a direct result of the U.S. retreating over the past period. And frankly, I think it began under President Obama, but it really accelerated under President Trump from its traditional role of trying to jump into these regional conflicts and play a mediating and balancing role. You know, you would never in the past 60 years have had a Kashmir conflict that the U.S. wasn't trying to do some shuttle diplomacy on, and we just sort of ignored it, and so things have exacerbated. And you see the same in the way Russia and Turkey are going at each other in 4 or 5 places around the world. So I think when we don't offer to our good offices for conflict resolution, things do get more dangerous. Do I think we're going to have a full-blown war between China and India? I don't think it's the priority for either one, but again, you could miscalculate, and there are still plenty of people suffering, and more importantly, you know, both China and India need growth. They don't need to be constraining each other's growth through this stupid stuff, right? So let's put it that way. Your second question was about Chinese modernization. Yeah, I worry, as Mike Morrell does, I worry about the fact that they are well ahead of us in artificial intelligence, in part because all of these platforms from Huawei to TikTok to WeChat allow them to, you know, suck mass amounts of data, which is the engine of AI advancement. They're ahead in quantum. And so because they steal so much, they don't have to develop their security systems over time. They can, you know, jump a generation or 2 or 3. They have unlimited resources to put into it. And the thing I worry about most, and I assume Mike talked about this, is that they are growing their nuclear arsenal. And we really have never had nuclear arms control with China. I have some sympathy for the Trump administration's effort to bring them into U.S.-Russian arms control. I frankly don't think that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to confront Chinese weapon systems with more missile defenses and other things that blunt them out in the neighborhood, and then say to them, would you like to talk about this and have some constraints or not? And we haven't even begun those conversations in either political party.
In terms of another proliferation issue that we've had multiple questions on is the Iranian nuclear deal. We had Brian Hook on last week. He gave a robust defense of the maximum pressure policy, saying that is essentially bringing Iran to its knees economically. And he envisioned a scenario that Iran could come to the negotiating table relatively quickly in a second Trump term. Can you talk about the reasons behind the 2015 nuclear deal? Some clients are saying, why did we go into the deal? What was the purpose of the deal? What did it achieve? And if we get second Trump, would we potentially see a deal with Iran? And with the Biden administration, how quickly do you envision going back into JCPOA?
Look, I don't think that anybody, including the architects of the deal, would claim that the nuclear deal with Iran was perfect. You know, first of all, it only attacked the nuclear sins of Iran. It didn't attack their support for terrorism, their, acquisition of territory in Syria and other places, their terrorism support, etc. And even within the nuclear realm, it wasn't infinite. It didn't speak about what happened at the end of the period of the agreement, and they got a lot of cash up front, which they used for nefarious purposes. But I still don't understand why you would want to throw out an imperfect nuclear agreement and end up with no nuclear agreement, such that these 4 years the Iranians have had all kinds of freedom to break out and start rebuilding. And yes, the sanctions are bringing Iranian people to their knees and pitting them against their government. But is it changing Iranian behavior in terms of their decisions with regard to acquisition of nuclear capability or support for terrorism or their policies in Syria, Libya, elsewhere in their neighborhood? I don't think so. So I would rather have had the floor and the cap on the nuclear file so that you could then go on to work on the rest and work on what happened after that deal and close the holes in it, which is frankly what Brian Hook himself supported initially in the administration, then just rip the thing up and have no constraints and have have the United States alone and a whole new generation of Iranians seeing us rather than their own government as the source of their economic pain. So, look, I think the Trump administration, the question is what kind of a deal they actually want, even if they got Iran to the table. And can they do it without allies and countries like Russia supporting them? I'm not so sure. And we're about to have elections in Iran next year, which could bring harder liners to the table. That could make it harder to get a deal. I think for the Biden administration, there's also a problem because unlike the Paris Climate Accord, where you can on day one re-sign and start, supporting policies domestically and internationally that are greener, there are so many holes in the old boat of the JCPOA that it's going to have to be rebuilt in some way. Now, can you, if you are willing to work with those same countries that did the deal to begin with, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, can you fix it? And will Iran come to the table on that? I think they'd be far more likely to come to the table on a JCPOA 2 than they would starting from scratch.
And can you talk about what might be in a JCPOA 2? Like, how would it differ from 1?
Well, I think we've learned some things, which is that there have to be, longer-term constraints. Ideally, what you want is for Iran to forswear nuclear weapons, which they don't do in JCPOA 1 in exchange for nuclear power. You want far better verification. I think you want to have a commitment that, yes, even as we get the nuclear deal, we're going to talk about and work on the other problems of Iranian malign behavior. So there are lots of things there that need to be addressed. But in particular now, the timelines are urgent because we've lost 4 years of a deal that should have been changing Iranian behavior and changing Iranian sense of their security without nuclear weapons. And instead, they've just become more insecure and more volatile.
I want to ask you more of a broader question now on the Middle East. I mean, you talked about the need in your foreign affairs piece where you believe to maintain a residual military presence in places like Syria, or we essentially cede the Middle East to Russia. How much of a vacuum have we left to be filled in the Middle East by countries like Russia? And then if we think about JCPOA 2, what would that mean for the U.S. position to countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain? Brian Hook talked a lot about the Abraham Accords and, how well received those have been in the region. Do you think that if we have a Biden administration, there could be sort of new tensions in our relations with these sort of traditional Gulf allies?
Well, it's interesting because the Trump administration really only focused on Israel, and I don't think anybody would dispute that it is a good thing for these Arab countries to be establishing diplomatic relations with Israel and working together. But that's a different matter than whether we are back to our traditional role, which is trying to corral the Gulf countries to work together on broader peace and security in the Middle East beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as the U.S. withdrew, and as the Gulf countries in particular began having conflicts with each other, you lost that ability to have a common approach, and you also end up with, Syria lighting on fire and Libya not being able to make that transition from Gaddafi to strong national governance. You have the Yemen conflict, which pits the sides against each other. So the Middle East is bleeding and the U.S. is watching. I think we all have learned from the big wars that it is better not to have a massive, long, enduring footprint. But sometimes when you provide security support in smaller increments in more places, I like to think about it as putting jelly on your sandwich all the way to the edges of the bread, right? It makes it harder for bad things to happen. So as an example, if after Gaddafi was deposed, if in the context of trying to help forge a new constitution and new government in Libya, we had put 5,000, 7,000 U.S., European peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers into Tripoli and also into Benghazi, might that have given the Libyan people a chance to have peace and have a democratic turning of the page after their 40-year political slumber under Gaddafi? And similarly, I don't think we should be giving Gulfies weapons that they can use against each other or use against other countries in their region. We should instead be working on a common approach to security, including in Syria. And now we've completely lost any right of negotiating place in Syria because we're not invested anymore at a level that would make a difference. Neither the Russians nor the Turks nor the Syrians have to listen to us. So I think that's a problem.
Well, we're coming up on the sort of closing minutes of our conversation. I'm wondering if there's anything I should have asked you, like that sort of proverbial sort of what keeps you up at night. I mean, we saw the ultimate black swan this year for our markets with COVID-19. What should we be paying attention to that may not be at the top of the Bloomberg terminal?
I am most worried right now, Halima, about a week from today, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I'm worried about our country post-election when we have a sitting president claiming that mail-in ballots are fraudulent, that this vote won't be fair. We have lots of people who are highly passionate. We have preparations for legal challenges, including the president's interest in having the Supreme Court primed for such a thing. And we have folks who are really tense on both sides. And we've already had examples of lots of violence on our streets. So America needs a clean, peaceful election. And we need the after effect to be clean and clear. And if there's a transfer of power, for that to happen smoothly and quickly. And if there's not a transfer of power, for it to be absolutely clear that that was the will of the American people so that we can move on and heal ourselves and get back into the job of global leadership. But I do worry that everything from court challenges to potential for violence is high in this country.
When I had Mike Morrell on, it was when President Trump had just been diagnosed with COVID-19, and I had asked him, what were the national security risks around a presidential health crisis? And I now ask you the question, what are the national security challenges around an extended election uncertainty? If we don't have the results, at midnight, November 4th, if it is a multi-week extended recount involving court challenges, are there, particular national security risks involved in that type of scenario?
Yeah, whenever we are obsessed with ourselves and diverted from international attention, that's when dissatisfied powers make their move because they know that we don't have the bandwidth to deal with it. So we talked about a Taiwan scenario for China. We could have Russia playing hard with its disinformation and deepfakes and other capabilities into the internal dispute. We could have North Korea make a move, because why not? Kim Jong-un Yoon doesn't like it when he's not the focus of attention. We could have a Russia-Turkey skirmish that brings in NATO. So I think this is the question: is who's out there planning what they're going to do November 4th to January, whatever it is, and can the American people come together and heal quickly, whatever the results of this election?
And I now want to turn to, again, we started off with the conversation about your biography. And I'm wondering, a lot of the speakers we've had in this series, I've asked them to reflect on sort of what was the toughest challenge they faced in their career, and what was the thing when they look back at they're most proud of? Like, what's the accomplishment that you look back and say, like, this was a capstone on my career?
Oh my goodness. You know, I've had such a Forrest Gump style experience where I've managed to be a witness to history by accident many, many times. And that's why I stayed in so long and why I loved it so much. I guess there are two things. One for a Republican president and one for a Democratic president. I was at NATO as our deputy to the ambassador on September 11th. And everybody will remember that 24 hours after we were hit, NATO invoked Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. And at the time, we didn't even know who had hit us. We didn't know what we would ask of NATO allies. We later asked them to join us in Afghanistan. And at the moment when that vote had to be taken, Washington was obviously very distracted. And we woke them up and said, you know, we think we can get a full vote, but NATO votes by unanimity. And if we had had even one defecting ally, one country who didn't stand with us that day, and we had some for whom it was difficult because they had, you know, coalition governments, etc., then not only would we have just been hit on September 11th, but we would wreck NATO when we asked it to invoke Article 5 if it hadn't. But when it did, and when all our allies stood with America, and we were able to provide that comfort and support and next step preparedness for how we would react, that was an incredibly proud moment. And then the second piece was, you know, during the Russia-Ukraine violence, the seizure of Crimea, the Maidan revolt, when the Ukrainian people, you know, stood for weeks and weeks and weeks in the snow and demanded a chance to associate with Europe, and then Russia took punitive measures against first by seizing Crimea and then by invading in the east. And, you know, it was clear that we weren't going to go to military war with Russia over this, but that we had to exact enough cost to get Russia to stop and not try to re-seize all of Ukraine. And I think the combined effort of America and Europe and our other allies in Asia to impose sanctions, impose costs, impose political, economic, and some security costs, and to support Ukraine was a moment that didn't have to happen, and it did. And, you know, not all of Ukraine was saved, but 93% of it was. So we gave them a chance to have the future that they wanted, and I was very proud to be part of that for a Democratic president.
Yeah. And final question before we let you go. I mean, I've already recommended to everyone your foreign affairs piece.
Oh.
What is on, if you could leave listeners and viewers with like 2 book recommendations or 2 article recommendations, what should we be reading now? What's on your nightstand?
Well, I'm reading a lot of fiction, frankly, right now to kind of escape from COVID. But one of the pieces, the books that I recommend for my students is David Sanger's Perfect Weapon, which is about how these cyber tools are used, including by the United States. I think everybody should be learning about the whole complex of digital challenges that we have. So that's one of the things on my nightstand. What else am I thinking about? I'm thinking a lot about how the U.S. can restore its leadership role in the world, no matter who's elected, because I really do think we're heading into a real period of increasing small conflicts that could result in big conflicts if we don't get ahead of this stuff. So, and I'm reading some economics because, you know, to try to better understand your world and better understand how the financial tool can be used to strengthen the middle class and strengthen confidence in democratic governance and strengthen people's optimism about the future.
Well, Ambassador Nuland, I always feel optimistic when I read what you write, when I listen to you. I would recommend everyone also going to Frontline. There's a fantastic interview, extended interview with Ambassador Nuland in a series called The Putin Files. I want to thank you for your service to this country. Again, I think you are an incredible source of inspiration. You combine incredible grace under pressure, substantive knowledge, and incredible toughness in the situations that you have been in. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your service. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us in the first Presidential Policy Hour, now our Beyond the Ballot series. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching live. Thank you for watching the interviews as we've posted them to the website. Everyone be well. And with that, we bring us to a conclusion. Thank you.
This content is based on information available at the time it was recorded and is for informational purposes only. It is not an offer to buy or sell or a solicitation, and no recommendations are implied. It is outside the scope of this communication to consider whether it is suitable for you and your financial objectives.